Today's deep dive explores the making of the 1975 film Jaws, tracing how a uniquely disastrous production transformed Hollywood's business model and permanently altered our cultural relationship with the ocean. We are going to unpack the script's chaotic development, the grueling 159-day ocean shoot, the accidental brilliance of Hitchcockian restraint, and the birth of the modern summer blockbuster. Our mission today is to provide you, the listener, with a comprehensive look at how a mechanical failure on set inadvertently created a masterpiece of suspense and rewrote the rules of the film industry.
It really is just an unbelievable story when you look at how it all started.
Right, because we're skipping all the story summaries today and jumping straight into the historical deep end here. To understand the monumental shift this film caused, we have to start with this incredibly flimsy foundation it was built on. Because the inception of this hit wasn't, some sprawling studio bidding war over a finished masterpiece. It literally started with a tiny, incredibly brief plot description card in a magazine office in 1973.
Yeah, that detail always gets me. It really highlights the kind of haphazard nature of the 1970s studio system.
Totally.
So producers Richard D. Zanuck and David Brown were at Universal Pictures, right? And they were looking for the next project. Back then, the pipeline for finding material relied heavily on literary scouts and magazine editors. And in this case, David Brown's wife was Helen Gurley Brown, who was the legendary editor of Cosmopolitan magazine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And the magazine's book editor had typed up this brief summary card for an upcoming unreleased novel by an author named Peter Benchley. The card just outlined the premise, a rogue shark terrorizing a resort town, and ended with 5 words. Might make a good movie.
So based on a one-paragraph summary from a lifestyle magazine, they just bought the rights. That seems incredibly reckless for veteran producers.
Well, it was impulsive, yeah. But that was the culture of the era. I mean, the new Hollywood period was defined by gut instincts rather than, focus groups. So Zanuck and Brown read the book in a single night and bought the film rights for $175,000 before the novel even hit shelves.
Wow.
But here is the critical failure in their process, right? David Brown later admitted that if they had read the book a second time, the movie would never have been made.
Wait, really? Why?
Because the first read just gave them the thrill of the narrative. A second read would have exposed the sheer, insurmountable logistics of shooting complex action sequences involving a massive predator on the open ocean.
Right, they had no idea how hard that actually is.
Exactly. They were blinded by this high-concept premise and entirely naive to the physical execution.
And that naivete trickled down immediately to the personnel they hired, didn't it? Because they initially handed this project to a director named Dick Richards, and he didn't even make it to production.
No, he didn't. Richards had just made his directorial debut, and Zanuck and Brown thought, he could handle a thriller. But during the pre-production meetings, Richards continually referred to the antagonist not as a shark, but as a whale.
A whale?
Yeah. He kept saying things like, and then the whale comes out of the water.
I would imagine that fundamentally changes the psychology of the film. I mean, a whale is a mammal. It's relatable. It breathes air. It has a consciousness we can somewhat project onto. But a shark is an ancient cartilaginous fish with dead eyes.
Yes. That is the exact distinction Zanuck and Brown realized Richards was failing to grasp. If your director doesn't understand the biological and psychological terror of your monster, the suspense will fail. So Richards was fired.
Which creates a vacuum.
Right. And it was filled by a 26-year-old Steven Spielberg.
26? That's wild.
Yeah, he was a kid. But Spielberg had recently directed his first theatrical feature for Zanuck and Brown, The Sugarland Express. And when he spotted their copy of Benchley's manuscript, he actively begged for the job.
Oh, he knew he wanted it.
He did. Because Spielberg saw a direct thematic bridge between Jaws and a television movie he had directed in 1971 called Duel.
Oh, Duel. That's the one about a businessman driving through the desert who gets terrorized by a massive, rusted, Peterbilt semi-truck. And the driver of the truck is never clearly seen.
That's the connection exactly. Both narratives feature an isolated everyman being hunted by a relentless, massive, almost faceless leviathan.
Right.
Spielberg understood that the terror wasn't about the specific creature. It was about the unstoppable, irrational momentum of the threat. He actually even carried that connection through to the post-production of Jaws.
How so?
He took the exact audio recording of the truck falling off a cliff in Duel and mixed it into the sound design for the shark's death roar at the climax of Jaws.
Oh, that's such a cool Easter egg.
Yeah. But here's the crazy part. Despite seeing this vision so clearly, Spielberg almost walked away.
Wait, why beg for a job only to try and back out before cameras even roll?
Fear of typecasting. As the reality of this water shoot approached, Spielberg just panicked. He realized he was about to spend months dealing with mechanical rigs and action set pieces, and he was terrified that the Hollywood establishment would permanently brand him as the truck and shark director, a guy who just directs mindless action machines.
I see.
He desperately wanted to pivot to a refined, sophisticated comedy called Lucky Lady over at 20th Century Fox. He formally asked to be released from his contract.
And Universal essentially told him he was trapped.
They strictly enforced the contract, yeah. Universal vetoed the move, and David Brown had to literally talk Spielberg off the ledge, promising him that if he delivered Jaws, he would have the clout to make whatever he wanted for the rest of his life.
Well, he wasn't wrong.
True. So Spielberg stayed, but the environment he stayed in was a total pressure cooker. The studio handed him a budget of $3.5 million and an incredibly restrictive 55-day shooting schedule.
But that schedule wasn't based on how long it would actually take to shoot the film, right? It was an artificial deadline imposed by labor disputes.
That is the crux of why the production was so chaotic. Hollywood was facing an impending Screen Actors Guild strike. Universal executives drew a hard line. The film had to finish principal photography by the end of June 1974 before the industry completely shut down.
Wow, okay.
And this mandate forced the production to rush forward without a locked script.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It was. Peter Benchley, the novelist, had written 3 separate drafts of the screenplay, trying to beat a potential Writers Guild strike that had threatened the industry earlier.
But it's one thing to write a novel, and screenwriting is an entirely different mechanical skill. I understand Benchley struggled significantly with the dialogue.
Oh, Benchley openly confessed that he did not know how to write character texture for the screen. He could construct the plot mechanics, and he obviously knew the oceanography, but the human beings interacting in the scenes just felt completely wooden.
Right.
To fix this, the producers went on a desperate hunt for writers. Spielberg offered the script to John Byram and then to Richard Levinson and William Link, who were the creators of the television show Columbo.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but they all passed. Eventually, a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright named Howard Sackler was brought in to do uncredited rewrites, specifically trying to give the characters some psychological depth.
But the real heavy lifting ended up falling to someone with a very unexpected background for a horror movie, a comedy writer named Carl Gottlieb.
Exactly. Gottlieb was working on the television sitcom The Odd Couple. Spielberg brought him in initially just for a 1-week dialogue polish to, punch up the interactions between the main cast.
Just a quick polish.
Right. But because the script was in such dire shape, Gottlieb was essentially promoted on the spot to the primary screenwriter. For 9 weeks, while the crew was actively filming during the day, Gottlieb was rewriting the entire script night by night.
Okay, let's unpack this. The script was literally being written the night before scenes were shot. Doesn't that usually guarantee a cinematic disaster? How did this frantic day-by-day writing process actually help the movie?
Well, it sounds like a guaranteed failure, I agree, but the chaos actually created this unique incubator for character development. Gottlieb wasn't just writing in a vacuum in his hotel room. He was eating dinner every night with Steven Spielberg, Roy Scheider, Richard Dreyfuss, and Robert Shaw.
Oh, so they were all together?
Yeah. They would discuss the scenes scheduled for the next day. The actors would improvise dialogue, argue about their characters' motivations, and Gottlieb would synthesize those arguments into the screenplay. He was tailoring the dialogue to the specific cadences and real-time chemistry of the cast.
So they were essentially workshopping a stage play while simultaneously filming a massive action movie.
Exactly. And Benchley's original drafts were incredibly cynical. One of the most glaring examples was a subplot involving a torrid, miserable affair between the marine biologist Matt Hooper and the police chief's wife, Ellen Brody.
Yet, if that subplot remains in the film, the entire third act falls apart. You cannot have the audience root for Hooper and Brody to survive together on a small boat if Hooper is actively destroying Brody's marriage.
Spielberg recognized that immediately. The survival of the film depended on the audience believing the camaraderie between the men on the Orca. Gottlieb's late-stage rewrites systematically stripped away Benchley's melodramatic, unlikable subplots.
Thank goodness.
Right. By incorporating the actors' input, the script evolved from a dark, cynical monster movie into a grounded story about vulnerable, relatable people forced into an unimaginable situation.
And this intense focus on grounded vulnerability leads perfectly into how they actually cast those roles. Because Universal didn't want vulnerable, relatable people. They wanted traditional, bankable movie stars.
Of course they did. In the 1970s, the primary marketing tool for a studio picture was the face on the poster. Universal pushed hard for massive superstars. They suggested Robert Redford, Paul Newman, or Steve McQueen to play the leads.
Right.
But Spielberg adamantly refused.
From a studio perspective, casting Steve McQueen seems like a guaranteed return on investment. Why would a 26-year-old director fight so hard against having guaranteed star power?
Because of the psychological baggage that comes with a movie star, Spielberg argued that if Robert Redford walks onto the screen, the audience immediately knows he's going to survive.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, he brings a legacy of heroism and competence with him. Spielberg wanted somewhat anonymous actors. He needed the audience to look at the screen and project themselves onto the characters.
Right. If they look like normal, flawed individuals, the threat feels real.
Exactly. Furthermore, Spielberg explicitly told the studio that the only superstar in this movie was going to be the shark.
Which resulted in a casting process that was just as chaotic and improvised as the script writing. Let's look at Police Chief Martin Brody.
Yeah, so the studio offered Brody to Robert Duvall. Duvall turned it down because he only wanted to play the eccentric shark hunter, Quint, but the producers felt Duvall was far too young for that role. Then, Charlton Heston actively campaigned to play Brody. He had just done Airport 1975 and Earthquake, and he wanted another disaster film.
But Heston falls right back into the Robert Redford problem. I mean, he's Moses, he's Ben-Hur. You don't believe Charlton Heston is afraid of the water?
Spielberg felt exactly the same way. Heston's screen persona was far too grand for a humble, neurotic police chief of a small island. The role eventually went to Roy Scheider through pure happenstance.
How so?
Scheider was at a Hollywood party, noticed Spielberg looking incredibly stressed, and just sat down next to him. Scheider eavesdropped as Spielberg described a scene where a shark leaps out of the water onto the back of a boat. He was captivated and essentially asked for the part right then and there.
That is amazing. And what about Quint, the working-class, Ahab-esque shark hunter?
Quint was a mess. With just 9 days left before principal photography was scheduled to begin, they still had not cast Quint.
9 days?
9 days. They offered it to Lee Marvin, who declined, famously saying he'd rather go fishing for real. They offered it to Sterling Hayden, who passed due to tax issues. Finally, Zanuck and Brown suggested a British actor they had just worked with on The Sting, Robert Shaw.
But a classically trained, highly theatrical British actor doesn't immediately scream New England fisherman.
No, not at all. And Shaw himself hated the novel. He found it trashy.
Really?
Yeah, he only accepted the role because both his wife and his secretary aggressively pressured him to take the paycheck. But once Shaw arrived on Martha's Vineyard, he recognized he needed a real-world anchor for the performance. He found it in a local island eccentric named Craig Kingsbury.
Oh, okay.
Kingsbury was a dairy farmer and fisherman who spoke in a highly specific, archaic dialect. Shaw would record Kingsbury speaking, mimic his cadence, and just adopt his belligerent working-class toughness. The production even cast Kingsbury in a minor role as the doomed fisherman Ben Gardner.
Oh, that's who that was.
Yeah.
And rounding out the trio is Richard Dreyfuss as Matt Hooper, the wealthy, educated marine biologist.
Right. So Spielberg's first choice for Hooper was Jon Voight. He also considered Jeff Bridges and Jan Michael Vincent. It was actually George Lucas who suggested Richard Dreyfuss to Spielberg, having just directed him in American Graffiti.
Okay.
But Dreyfuss initially turned the role down. He didn't want to spend months on a boat.
So what changed his mind?
Pure career panic. Dreyfuss attended a private screening of his upcoming film, The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. He was so deeply horrified by his own performance that he became convinced he would be blacklisted from the industry once the film was released.
You're kidding?
No. Desperate for a lifeline to keep his career afloat, he called Spielberg back and begged for the role of Hooper. Spielberg agreed, but gave Dreyfuss a very specific instruction. He told him not to read Benchley's novel.
Why not?
Because the character in the book was arrogant and stiff. Spielberg and Carl Gottlieb were completely rewriting the character to perfectly match Dreyfuss's manic, intellectual, and slightly neurotic energy.
That makes so much sense. And that commitment to realism extended even to the background actors and the stunt work. I mean, they didn't cast Hollywood extras. They populated the town with actual residents of Martha's Vineyard to capture the authentic look of a weary, off-season island community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the very first victim we see on screen, Chrissy Watkins, wasn't played by a traditional actress.
No, she was played by Susan Backlany, a professional stuntwoman and former animal trainer. Spielberg needed someone who didn't just know how to swim, but understood the specific, powerful mechanics of treading water while being violently jerked back and forth by cables.
Right, because that scene is brutal.
It is. Furthermore, she was entirely comfortable performing the grueling, physically demanding water stunts completely nude, which added an extreme layer of vulnerability and primal fear to that opening sequence.
I get wanting every man to make it feel real, but given that they were pioneering this massive summer release, wasn't it an insane financial risk for Universal to not have a guaranteed, bankable superstar on the poster?
Oh, it was an unprecedented gamble. In the landscape of 1970s cinema, star power was the primary currency that secured international distribution and marketing deals. But Spielberg was betting on a paradigm shift.
Okay.
He believed that a high-concept premise, like this primal universal fear of being eaten alive, was more marketable than a famous face. He theorized that relatable actors would allow the audience to internalize the terror. But, as you'll see, that absolute, uncompromising commitment to realism is exactly what drove them to shoot on the open ocean, which nearly resulted in the total collapse of the production.
Yeah, the decision to shoot on the actual Atlantic Ocean rather than in a studio tank. Why Martha's Vineyard specifically? If you want to shoot on the ocean, there's coastline all over California right next to the studio.
Well, Martha's Vineyard offered a very specific, rare geological advantage. To shoot a film on the water and make it look like deep, isolated ocean, you have to ensure the camera never sees the shoreline in the background. But the mechanical sharks weighed tons and required massive underwater platforms to operate. Therefore, they needed an ocean floor that was shallow enough to anchor the rigs, but far enough away from land to maintain the illusion of isolation.
I see.
And the coastal shelf off Martha's Vineyard features a sandy bottom that never drops below a depth of 35 feet for a distance of 12 miles out to sea. It was geographically perfect.
Geographically perfect, but technologically disastrous.
Completely. Jaws was the first major motion picture to attempt principal photography on the open ocean. The crew was entirely unprepared for the sheer, relentless hostility of the elements. Let's just look at the numbers. The scheduled 55-day shoot ballooned to an agonizing 159 days.
Oh my God.
The studio-mandated budget of $3.5 million skyrocketed to $9 million, and a full $3 million of that went exclusively toward the mechanical effects that repeatedly failed.
We need to examine why the mechanics failed so spectacularly.
Yeah.
Because they had 3 separate pneumatically powered prop sharks, which the crew ironically named Bruce after Spielberg's lawyer, Bruce Raymer.
Yeah, Bruce. The physical design team was highly respected, too. The art director was Joe Alves, and the mechanical effects supervisor was Bob Matty. He was the man famous for designing the giant squid in the 1954 film 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
So he knew what he was doing.
You'd think so. Matty constructed 3 variations of Bruce. A full-body model meant to be towed by a 300-foot underwater cable, a right-sided platform shark, and a left-sided platform shark, which were mounted on massive steel sleds and controlled by pneumatic pistons.
But pneumatics operate on compressed air or gas to create mechanical motion. When you introduce complex, sensitive pneumatic valves into the corrosive environment of the Atlantic Ocean, you are fighting basic physics.
You are. And the engineering failures were catastrophic and immediate. First, the skin of the shark was cast in a non-absorbent neoprene foam. But Matty's team didn't account for the sustained pressure of salt water. The foam acted like a sponge, absorbing the heavy seawater until the shark ballooned to comical proportions and lost its buoyancy, literally sinking to the ocean floor. Yeah. Secondly, the immense hydraulic resistance of the ocean currents placed too much torque on the internal steel frames, causing them to fracture. And finally, the high salinity of the seawater instantly corroded the pneumatic hoses and valves, leading to complete operational failure.
Shooting this movie was basically like trying to build a complex airplane while you're already in free fall over the Atlantic Ocean. You have no script, your lead actors are fighting, and your engine, the shark, is literally sinking to the bottom of the sea.
That analogy perfectly captures the sheer panic of the daily production. The set was so notoriously cursed that the crew began wearing custom t-shirts that sarcastically renamed the movie Flaws.
Flaws is great.
The elements fought them at every turn, too. Tides would shift, completely altering the continuity of the lighting. Unwanted sailboats would drift into the background of a shot, ruining hours of setup.
You can't imagine.
The actors were perpetually seasick. And the orca, the fishing boat set pieces actually began to take on water and sink with the actors and camera equipment still on board during a take, forcing an emergency evacuation.
And on top of the mechanical and environmental disasters, the human element was deteriorating.
The isolation and delays bred intense conflict. Robert Shaw was struggling with severe chronic alcoholism. Furthermore, he was facing massive tax liabilities in the United Kingdom and the United States, meaning he had to frequently flee the country to Canada on his days off just to avoid the IRS.
Wait, he was fleeing the country during production?
Yeah. And when he was on set, his anxiety and drinking manifested as hostility toward Richard Dreyfuss. Shaw, a classical theater veteran, viewed Dreyfuss as an arrogant, undisciplined youngster.
Right.
The two formed a bitter, highly publicized grudge, constantly trading insults. But Spielberg ultimately harnessed that to fuel the on-screen tension between Quint and Hooper.
It sounds like an unmitigated disaster fueled by arrogance.
Spielberg himself later admitted that the entire endeavor was born from the supreme hubris of a 26-year-old director. He openly stated he was utterly naive about Mother Nature. He genuinely believed his career was over. Rumors were rampant in Hollywood that Spielberg would never be hired again because in the studio system, nobody goes 100 days over schedule without facing permanent exile.
Did the studio try to step in?
Yeah, Universal executives flew out to the set and offered him multiple chances to shut down the ocean shoot and move to a controlled indoor water tank in Hollywood. But Spielberg stubbornly dug his heels in. He demanded the authenticity of the Atlantic horizon, even if it destroyed his career.
But the paradox of Jaws is that this supreme hubris and the resulting mechanical failure birthed the greatest pivot in the history of suspense cinema. Because Bruce the Shark rarely functioned, Spielberg had to figure out how to make a creature feature without actually showing the creature.
Exactly. Spielberg famously referred to the failure of the mechanical shark as a godsend. It forced a total stylistic and philosophical shift in the film's visual language. Prior to Jaws, the standard for monster movies was the Ray Harryhausen model. Harryhausen was the master of stop-motion animation, creating films where the monsters, like giant cyclopes or dinosaurs, were on-screen constantly, moving in full view of the audience.
But if your monster looks like a waterlogged piece of rubber, showing it ruins the illusion entirely.
Precisely. So Spielberg had to pivot away from the Harryhausen model and embrace the psychology of Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock's core philosophy of suspense relies on the audience's imagination. It's the concept of the bomb under the table.
Yes, the anticipation.
If you show a bomb, the audience is engaged. If you hide the monster, the audience's brain begins projecting their own darkest fears into the empty space.
Wow.
It is the psychological principle of the less you see, the more you get. Spielberg had to find visual substitutions to suggest the shark's presence without showing the mechanics.
And this is where the brilliant use of the yellow floating barrels comes into play.
It is a masterclass in visual storytelling through limitation. For a massive portion of the third act, the audience isn't watching a shark at all. They are watching bright yellow, buoyant barrels skimming rapidly across the surface of the water.
Right.
The barrels are attached to the shark by harpoon lines. So you watch the barrel plunge beneath the surface, and your brain does the terrifying mathematical calculation of the immense size and strength required to pull that much buoyancy underwater. The barrel becomes a far more terrifying avatar for the monster than the rubber shark ever could be.
I am stuck on something regarding the logistics of this pivot, though. If Spielberg is adapting on the fly, shooting yellow barrels one day, and then trying to shoot comedy scenes the next day just to keep the crew busy while the mechanics repair the shark, how does this not result in a completely schizophrenic tone in the final cut? Who is policing the narrative cohesion?
That is where we have to discuss the monumental contribution of the film's editor, Verna Fields. Fields was a veteran editor, affectionately known as Mother Cutter. She was stationed out on Martha's Vineyard, receiving this chaotic, disjointed daily footage. She was the one sculpting the tension.
Okay.
Because Spielberg was constantly compensating for broken horror setups by shooting character moments, Fields had to reconstruct the tone in the editing bay.
But how does an editor turn a comedy scene into a horror scene?
By manipulating the Kuleshov effect and the pacing of the cuts, Fields realized that holding a frame of an actor staring out at the water for just 2 seconds longer than normal transforms a moment of quiet reflection into a moment of agonizing dread.
Just by extending the shot.
Exactly. She took scenes Spielberg had intended to be lighthearted character beats and, by stripping away dialogue and holding on reaction shots, cut them to be tense and terrifying. Conversely, she found moments of brevity to insert after high tension to give the audience a chance to breathe.
And she also had to seamlessly integrate incredibly lucky real-world footage to patch the gaps in the narrative. I'm talking about the Australian footage.
Oh, yes. Universal hired renowned Australian underwater filmmakers Ron and Valerie Taylor to shoot live-action footage of real great white sharks off the coast of South Australia. To make the real 14-foot sharks look like the fictional 25-foot behemoth in the film, the Taylors built a half-scale miniature shark cage and placed a very short actor, a little person, inside it for scale.
Right, so the forced perspective makes the average-sized shark look like a leviathan.
The visual trick worked perfectly, but during filming, a real great white accidentally got its snout tangled in the cables attached to the miniature cage.
Oh my gosh.
The animal panicked and began thrashing wildly, completely destroying the cage in a violent frenzy. The footage was viscerally terrifying. Spielberg and Fields watched the dailies and knew immediately they had to include this unparalleled footage in the final cut.
But that creates a massive narrative problem based on Benchley's script.
A completely irreconcilable problem. In Benchley's novel, and in the shooting script at that point in production, Matt Hooper is lowered into the water in the cage, the shark attacks, and Hooper is brutally killed. But in the real footage from Australia, the miniature cage was completely empty when the shark destroyed it. The stuntman wasn't in the shot.
So they changed the destiny of a main character purely to accommodate B-roll footage.
They absolutely did. Entirely to utilize this spectacular, accidental footage of the empty cage being destroyed, Carl Gottlieb rewrote the ending of the film. They altered the narrative so that Hooper escapes the cage and hides on the ocean floor while the shark demolishes the metal bars, allowing Hooper to survive the film. A tangled cable in the Pacific Ocean literally saved Richard Dreyfuss's character from being killed off.
That is wild. And Spielberg was so deeply obsessed with maximizing the psychological impact that he even bypassed the studio system entirely to secure one final visceral scare.
Right. After a preliminary test screening, Spielberg noted the audience's reactions. He felt the pacing of the second act was slightly off. He told Verna Fields he wanted one more scream to keep the tension from sagging.
Oh.
He conceived a jump scare where Hooper investigates a sunken boat in the middle of the night, and the severed head of the fisherman Ben Gardner suddenly floats into a hole in the hull.
But principal photography was over, and they were millions over budget. I assume Universal refused to fund a reshoot.
Universal flatly denied the request. They refused to give him a single dollar. So Spielberg financed the reshoot himself. He took $3,000 out of his own pocket.
No way.
Yeah. He had the effects team create a latex life-cast model of Craig Kingsbury's head with an eye missing. But since he couldn't afford a studio water tank, he took the crew to Verna Fields' personal backyard swimming pool in Encino, California.
Wait, how do you make a pristine, chlorinated backyard swimming pool look like the murky, terrifying depths of the Atlantic Ocean at midnight?
Through sheer low-budget mechanical ingenuity. They stretched a massive opaque tarpaulin over the entire pool to block out the California sunlight and simulate the darkness of night. Then, to recreate the particulate matter and murky visibility of ocean water, they poured gallons of powdered milk into the swimming pool.
Powdered milk.
Powdered milk. Spielberg operated the camera himself, plunging it into the milky water while a crew member pushed the latex head into the frame. It resulted in one of the most effective, terrifying jump scares in cinematic history, shot in a suburban backyard for $3,000.
So what does this all mean? If the greatest suspense thriller of all time was basically the result of broken machinery and desperate improvisations, does that mean cinematic genius is sometimes just a happy accident?
Well, it is tempting to call it an accident, but it is more accurate to view it as the ultimate proof that extreme limitations breed extreme creativity. When a filmmaker is given unlimited resources, the natural inclination is to show the audience everything.
Right, you show the monster, you show the geography.
But when you are severely restricted by failing mechanics and budgets, you are forced to rely on the audience's psychology. By removing the physical visual of the shark, Spielberg forced the audience's imagination to do the heavy lifting. The dread became entirely internalized. The audience wasn't scared of a rubber prop. They were terrified of what they weren't seeing beneath the surface of the water.
And because the visual presence of the shark was hidden for the vast majority of the runtime, the audio design had to compensate. The music essentially became the shark. Which brings us to the composer, John Williams.
It is mathematically impossible to overstate the impact of John Williams's Oscar-winning score on the success of Jaws. Steven Spielberg himself has stated on the record that the film would only have been half as successful, or perhaps a total failure, without Williams's music.
Wow.
The score provides the structural spine that the failing mechanical shark could not, and the genius of the main theme lies in its deceptive, brutal simplicity. It is built entirely around an alternating pattern of just two notes.
Let's break down the music theory of that. The theme is usually identified as oscillating between the notes E and F, or F and F sharp. It is an interval of a minor second. When Williams first introduced this minimalist concept to Spielberg, how was it received?
Spielberg literally laughed out loud. Williams sat down at a piano and began plinking out those two low notes with two fingers. Spielberg thought Williams was playing a joke on him.
He probably expected a sweeping, melodic pirate adventure score.
Exactly. But Williams understood the psychological assignment better than anyone. He recognized that the music didn't need to be melodic. It needed to be mechanical.
Let's dive into the mechanics of the instrumentation. He didn't just use standard cellos or basses for that heavy driving sound.
No, Williams specifically requested that the primary ostinato, the continually repeating musical phrase, be played by a tuba. He brought in a legendary studio musician named Tommy Johnson, but Williams instructed Johnson to play the tuba in an unusually high register for that specific instrument.
Why push a brass instrument into a register it isn't designed for? Does that create a specific sonic texture?
Exactly. When a musician forces a large brass instrument like a tuba into its higher registers, the physical strain on the instrument and the player creates a sound that is rougher, more abrasive, and inherently strained. It doesn't sound clean, it sounds threatening, it sounds like something massive is exerting terrible effort.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's literally just two notes. Why on earth does our brain instinctively link a simple alternating rhythm to impending doom? What is the evolutionary psychology behind our reaction to those two notes?
It taps into deep, primal neurology. The rhythm mimics the acceleration of a human heartbeat or rapid panicked respiration. As the tempo of the alternating notes increases, our brains subconsciously synchronize with the rhythm, inducing an autonomic anxiety response.
That is fascinating.
Furthermore, it mimics the Doppler effect of a massive object approaching. Williams described the relentless ostinato as representing an unstoppable force. The shark is mindless, instinctual, and constantly moving forward. The grinding repetition of those two notes acts as a sonic stand-in for the physical weight and predatory momentum of a creature that cannot be reasoned with.
It's pure instinct.
Right. Williams likened the broader, more aggressive parts of the score to primal pirate music, tapping into humanity's baseline evolutionary dread of the deep sea and the unknown creatures that inhabit it.
The score conditions the audience in a very Pavlovian way, too. We are trained throughout the first two acts. You hear the music, you know the shark is present.
And that rigorous hour-long conditioning is precisely what makes the brilliant use of silence so devastatingly effective. Music scholars and film theorists often point to a concept called the rupture.
The rupture.
Yeah. The rupture is the sudden, dead silence that occurs immediately after a violent attack in the film. The water stills, the music abruptly cuts out, and a vacuum of safety is created. The audience is allowed to exhale.
But Spielberg also uses that conditioning against the audience in the third act.
Brilliantly, because Williams spends 2 hours teaching the audience the rules music equals danger, silence equals safety. Spielberg shatters that rule at the climax.
Right.
In the famous scene where Brody is chumming the water, complaining about Hooper, the shark suddenly breaches the surface, massive and terrifying, right next to the boat. There is absolutely no musical introduction, no warning. The monster simply appears out of the silence. It subverts the psychological expectation the film just spent hours building, resulting in a visceral shock that a musical cue would have ruined.
It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation. And the sheer effectiveness of that manipulation resulted in an unprecedented box office phenomenon. Jaws didn't just make a lot of money. It quite literally rewired the DNA of how the film industry functioned, distributed, and marketed its products.
To understand the magnitude of the disruption, we have to look at how theater distribution actually functioned in 1974. Prior to Jaws, the industry standard was a model called the progressive release or platform release.
How did the progressive release model work mechanically?
A studio would open a film in a very limited number of theaters, perhaps 1 or 2 screens in major cultural hubs like New York and Los Angeles. They would wait for the prominent film critics to publish their reviews. If the reviews were positive, the studio would slowly expand the film to other major cities over a period of weeks or months.
Relying on word of mouth.
Exactly, relying almost entirely on word of mouth and critical prestige to build an audience. It was a slow, deliberate trickle.
But Universal took a totally different, incredibly aggressive approach with Jaws.
They did. Universal essentially pioneered and perfected what is now known as saturation booking. Instead of a slow platform rollout, they bypassed the critics entirely. They opened Jaws on 409 screens simultaneously across the United States and Canada on the exact same day.
Wow. To fill 409 theaters on opening weekend without relying on word of mouth, you have to ensure the public is already desperate to see the film before it even opens.
Which requires an unprecedented marketing blitz. Universal spent a staggering $1.8 million on the marketing campaign alone. To put that in perspective, they spent $700,000 exclusively on primetime national television advertisements.
That's unheard of for that time.
Completely unheard of. They carpet-bombed the television networks for 3 solid days leading up to the release date, ensuring that every demographic in the country saw the terrifying imagery and heard John Williams' score in their living rooms.
And the visual marketing, the print advertisements, and the poster was just as aggressive and meticulously engineered to induce fear. We have to discuss the iconic poster painted by Roger Castell.
The poster is a masterpiece of psychological graphic design. It was overseen by the Tony Seiniger advertising agency. Seiniger spent 6 months sketching different concepts, trying to figure out how to make a static image of a shark look terrifying.
Right, because a shark just looks like a fish from the side.
Exactly. He ultimately realized that a profile shot of a shark just looks like a large fish. To induce the maximum amount of visceral primal fear, you had to alter the perspective. He positioned the viewer underneath the shark, looking up.
Because that perspective exposes the teeth and creates a sense of profound vulnerability.
Exactly. The shark is rising vertically, its massive, almost phallic snout, and rows of razor-sharp teeth pointing directly toward an unsuspecting lone female swimmer at the surface. It taps into a primal fear of the unseen predator striking from the abyss below. The poster perfectly encapsulated the exact psychological terror that Spielberg was delivering on screen.
This saturation booking and aggressive marketing blitz also fundamentally altered the calendar of Hollywood releases. Before Jaws, releasing a movie in the middle of summer was considered financial suicide.
The summer months were viewed by studio executives as a graveyard. The prevailing wisdom was that during the summer, people wanted to be outside enjoying the weather, going to the beach, or taking vacations.
Yeah.
The winter months were considered the prestige season, where serious award-contending films were released to a captive indoor audience. Summer was where studios dumped their low-quality B-movies, exploitation films, and drive-in fodder.
Jaws proved that theory completely wrong.
Jaws proved that if you provide a massive, high-concept thrill ride, an event film audiences will gladly pack into air-conditioned theaters in the middle of July. It single-handedly shifted the prime movie release window from the winter to the summer, giving birth to the modern summer blockbuster season that dictates the industry calendar to this day.
And the financial returns validated every single chaotic, over-budget decision Spielberg made.
The financial records it broke are staggering. Jaws recouped its entire bloated $9 million production cost in just 10 days of theatrical release.
10 days.
In a mere 78 days, it overtook Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather to become the highest-grossing film in North American box office history. By the time it finished its various theatrical runs and re-releases in the 1970s, it had grossed an astounding $470 million worldwide.
Unbelievable.
It held the undisputed title of the highest-grossing film of all time until George Lucas released Star Wars 2 years later. And inevitably, that massive influx of capital spawned a tidal wave of cheap, aquatic knockoff movies from rival studios, films like Piranha, Orca, Great White, and Tentacles. Every studio was desperately chasing the Jaws formula.
If Jaws fundamentally ended the new Hollywood era of deeply personal, auteur-driven films like Taxi Driver or The French Connection, and ushered in the era of the high-concept, expensive corporate blockbuster, should film nerds actually resent this movie?
It is a debate that film scholars and historians have waged for decades, Scholars like Peter Biskind, in his book Easy Riders, Raging Bulls, argue that Jaws diminished the cultural importance of film criticism. By proving that a studio could use saturation booking and television ads to make a fortune on opening weekend before bad reviews could even be published, Jaws taught studios to chase fast, massive profits using easily marketable, high-concept ideas.
Right.
It essentially handed the power back to the corporate boardrooms and stripped it away from the rebellious, experimental filmmakers of the 1970s.
But is it fair to blame the film itself for the corporate greed of the industry that followed it?
Many critics argue it is not fair. It is vital to balance that cynical view with the artistic reality of the film. While Jaws certainly created the franchise formula that studios relentlessly chase today, the film itself remains an objectively brilliant piece of art. It boasts incredibly nuanced character work, flawless pacing, intricate editing, and profound thematic depth. Jaws proves that massive commercial appeal and high artistic merit are not mutually exclusive concepts. You shouldn't resent the masterpiece just because of the hollow imitations that followed in its wake.
And the impact of the film wasn't just contained to Hollywood business models. It bled out into the real world, causing literal cultural trauma and altering human behavior.
Psychologists actually coined the term the Jaws effect. The film induced a widespread, deeply ingrained, and largely irrational fear of the ocean across the global population. There is a documented medical case study of cinematic neurosis in a 17-year-old girl who, shortly after viewing the film in 1975, suffered severe sleep disturbances.
Oh, wow.
Her anxiety escalated until she eventually began hallucinating, convulsing in the hospital, and screaming sharks. Beach attendance across the United States demonstrably and significantly dropped in the summer of 1975. A Gallup poll conducted at the time showed that a massive percentage of the population felt an increased visceral fear of swimming in the ocean, regardless of geographic location.
But the most tragic real-world consequence wasn't human anxiety. It was the ecological disaster inflicted upon actual shark populations.
The ecological fallout was devastating. The film portrayed the great white shark not as an animal acting on instinct, but as a vengeful, mindless, malicious man-eater that held a grudge against humanity. This fictional portrayal directly inspired a surge of sport shark fishing tournaments along the coasts of America.
So sad.
It birthed a culture of trophy hunting that decimated shark populations globally. Thousands of apex predators were slaughtered by fishermen who genuinely felt they were performing a public service by clearing the waters of monsters.
How did the creators react to that real-world destruction?
Both Peter Benchley and Steven Spielberg later expressed profound, deep regret for this unintended ecological consequence. Benchley dedicated the rest of his life to ocean conservation. Yeah. And Spielberg has frequently stated that he believes sharks harbor a grudge against him for the frenzy he inadvertently caused. Both men dedicated significant time and resources in their later years to becoming vocal shark conservationists, trying desperately to undo the ecological damage their fiction had wrought.
Aside from the environmental impact, academic scholars have spent the last 50 years dissecting the socio-political themes of the film. It is far more than just a monster movie.
Oh, it is an incredibly rich text for academic analysis. For instance, many scholars view the film squarely through the lens of post-Watergate paranoia and the political disillusionment of the 1970s. The only true villain in the film, aside from an animal merely acting on biological instinct, is Mayor Larry Vaughn.
Right.
He is a local politician who deliberately ignores scientific fact, suppresses the truth, and puts human lives at risk purely for the sake of protecting the local summer economy and his own political standing.
It's fascinating that the human villain is a politician who keeps the beaches open during a deadly crisis just to protect the local economy. That feels incredibly prophetic. Do you think audiences in 1975 saw that as a specific critique, or is that just a universal human failing?
Well, it resonated deeply in a post-Watergate society where the public's trust in elected officials and institutions was at absolute rock bottom. The idea that a politician would lie to your face while you were in mortal danger felt very current in 1975. But it also reflects a universal, timeless conflict between public safety and economic preservation. Scholars also point out the heavy themes of class division represented by the three men isolated on the boat.
Let's break down that class structure.
You have Matt Hooper, who represents the intellectual elite, inherited wealth, and modern technology. He brings sonar in cages. Then you have Quint, who embodies working-class toughness, deep historical trauma from the USS Indianapolis, and archaic hands-on experience.
And Brody.
Caught in the middle is Martin Brody, the middle-class everyman, the civil servant who just wants to maintain order and survive. The boat becomes a microcosm of American society, forcing these disparate classes to either cooperate or be consumed.
And the literary influences underpinning those themes are worn right on the film's sleeve.
Absolutely. The narrative structure is a direct homage to classic literature. The most obvious parallel is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Quint is a direct, undeniable parallel to Captain Ahab. He's obsessed, driven by a deep-seated hatred for a specific leviathan, and he ultimately dies entangled in his own harpoon line, destroyed by his own obsession.
Even the boat is a reference, right?
Yes, the orca is named after the killer whale, which is the only natural biological enemy of the great white shark. Screenwriter Carl Gottlieb and Spielberg also heavily referenced Henrik Ibsen's 1882 play, An Enemy of the People.
What's that one about?
That play is about a doctor who discovers the profitable tourist hot springs in his town are contaminated, and when he tries to warn the public, the town shuns and attacks him to protect their economy. Chief Brody is that doctor, desperately trying to warn a town that refuses to listen to the truth until the blood is already in the water.
So we've unpacked a truly staggering historical and mechanical journey today. We've seen how the frantic, scriptless chaos of a production rushing to beat a labor strike actually stripped away cynicism and forged deeply relatable human characters. We've examined how a young director's naive hubris to shoot on the open continental shelf turned into a logistical nightmare where sinking sets, tax evasion, and corroding pneumatic valves threatened to destroy careers.
It really was a perfect storm.
It was. And yet, that very mechanical failure of a waterlogged rubber prop forced a brilliant pivot to psychological Hitchcockian suspense. That visual restraint, paired with John Williams' primal, neurologically triggering two-note score, created an absolute masterpiece. A masterpiece that didn't just break box office records, but fundamentally invented the saturation book's summer blockbuster, changed how movies are marketed, and forever altered humanity's relationship with the ocean.
Yeah, it changed everything.
But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the mechanics of everything we've discussed today. Imagine if Jaws were made today, greenlit by a modern studio with access to unlimited CGI budgets. The mechanical shark never would have broken down in the saltwater, because there wouldn't be a mechanical shark. It would be perfectly flawlessly rendered on a computer screen in post-production. The filmmakers, lacking those agonizing physical constraints, almost certainly would have shown the monster in every single scene. Thus, the greatest thriller ever made only exists because the technology of 1974 was inadequate. Is the perfection of modern cinematic technology actually destroying the very limitations that forced directors to be brilliant? Something to think about the next time you watch a flawless, computer-generated summer blockbuster.
It makes you appreciate the magic of a broken mechanical shark, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the waters of Amity Island, and we'll catch you on the next one.